This is about the old tree. I knew enough about the Catskill Mountains to know that when the summer came, they were covered with people. Although great-grandfather's farm was somewhat remote, still hikers and campers and hunters and fishermen were sure to wander across it. Therefore, I wanted a house that could not be seen. People would want to take me back where I belonged if they found me. I looked at that tree. Somehow I knew it was home, but I was not quite sure how it was home. The limbs were high and not right for a treehouse. I could build a bark extension around it, but that would look silly. Slowly, I circled the great trunk. Halfway around, the whole plan became perfectly obvious. To the west, between the two phalanges of the tree that spread out to be roots, was a cavity. The heart of the tree was rotting away. I scraped at it with my hands. Old, rotten, insect-ridden dust came tumbling out. I dug on and on, using my axe from time to time as my excitement grew. With much of the old rot out, I could crawl in the tree and sit cross-legged. Inside I felt as cozy as a turtle in its shell. I chopped and chopped until I was hungry and exhausted. I was now in the hard, good wood, and chopping it was work. I was afraid December would come before I got a hole big enough to lie in. So I sat down to think. You know, those first days, I just never planned right. I had the beginnings of a home, but not a bite to eat. And I had worked so hard that I could hardly move forward to find that bite. Furthermore, it was discouraging to feed that body of mine. It was never satisfied, and gathering food for it took time and got it hungrier. Trying to get a place to rest, it took time and got it more tired. And I really felt I was going in circles, and wonder how many primitive men ever had enough time and energy to stop hunting food and start thinking about fire and tools. I left the tree and went across the meadow looking for food. I plunged into the woods beyond, and there I discovered the gorge and the white cascade splashing down the black rocks into the pool below. I was hot and dirty. I scrambled down the rocks and slipped into the pool. It was so cold I yelled, but when I came out on the bank and put on my 2 pairs of trousers and 3 sweaters, which I thought was a better way to carry clothes than in a pack, I tingled and burned and felt coltish. I leapt up the bank, slipped, and my face went down in a patch of dog-tooth violets. You would know them anywhere after a few looks at them at the botanical gardens and in colored flower books. They are little yellow lilies with long, slender stems with oval leaves dappled with gray. But that's not all. They have wonderfully tasty bulbs. I was filling my pockets before I got up from my fall. I'll have a salad-type lunch, I said, as I moved up the steep sides of the ravine. I discovered that as late as it was in the season, the spring beauties were still blooming in the cool pockets of the woods. They were all right raw, that is, if you are as hungry as I was. They taste a little like lima beans. I ate these as I went on hunting food, feeling better and better, until I worked my way back to the meadow where the dandelions were blooming. Funny, I hadn't noticed them earlier. Their greens are good, and so are their roots. A little strong and milky, but you get used to that. A crow flew into the aspen grove without saying a word. The little I knew from crows, from following them in Central Park, they always have something to say. But this bird was sneaking obviously trying to be quiet. Birds are good food. Crow is certainly not the best, but I didn't know that then, and I launched out to see where it was going. I had a vague plan to try to noose it. This is the kind of thing I wasted time on in those days, when time was so important. However, this venture turned out all right, because I didn't have to noose that bird. I stepped into the woods, looked around, could not see the crow, but noticed a big stick nest in a scrabbly pine. I started to climb the tree. Off flew the crow. What made me keep on climbing in face of such discouragement, I don't know, but I did, and that noon I had crow eggs and wild salad for lunch. At lunch, I also solved the problem of carving out my tree. After a struggle, I made a fire. Then I sewed a big skunk cabbage leaf into a cup with grass strands. I had read that you can boil water in a leaf, and ever since then, I had been very anxious to see if this were true. It seems impossible, but it works. I boiled the eggs in a leaf. The water keeps the leaf wet, and although the top dries up and burns down to the water level, that's as far as the burning goes. I was pleased to see it work. Then here's what happened. Naturally, all this took a lot of time, and I hadn't gotten very far on my tree. So I was fretting and stamping out the fire when I stopped with my foot in the air. The fire! Indians made dugout canoes with fire. They burned them out. An easier and much faster way of getting results. I would try fire in the tree. If I was very careful, perhaps it would work. I ran into the hemlock forest with a burning stick and got a fire going inside the tree. Thinking that I ought to have a bucket of water in case things got out of hand, I looked desperately around me. The water was far across the meadow and down the ravine. This would never do. I began to think the whole inspiration of a home in a tree was no good. I really did have to live near water for cooking and drinking and comfort. I looked sadly at the magnificent hemlock and was about to put the fire out and desert it when I said something to myself. It must have come out of some book. Hemlocks usually grow around mountain streams and springs. I swirled on my heel. Nothing but boulders around me, but the air was damp. Somewhere, I said, and darted around the rocks, peering and looking and sniffing, and going down into pockets and dales. No water. I was coming back, circling wide, when I almost fell in it. 2 sentinel boulders, dripping wet, decorated with flowers, ferns, moss, weeds, everything that loved water, guarded a bathtub-sized spring. You pretty thing, I said, flopping on my stomach, and pushed my face into it to drink. I opened my eyes. The water was like glass. In it were little insects with oars. They rowed away from me. Beetles skittered like bullets on the surface, or carried a silver bubble of air with them to the bottom. Ha! Then I saw a crayfish. I jumped up, overturned the rocks, and found many crayfish. At first I hesitated to grab them, because they can pinch. I gritted my teeth, thought about how much more it hurts to be hungry, and came down upon them. I did get pinched, but I had my dinner, and that was the first time I had planned ahead. Any planning that I did in those early days was such a surprise to me, and so successful that I was delighted with even a small plan. I wrapped the crayfish in leaves, stuffed them in my pockets, and went back to burning the tree. Bucket of water, I thought. Bucket of water? Where was I going to get a bucket? How did I even think, even if I found water, I could get it back to the tree? That's how citified I was in those days. I had never lived without a bucket before. Scrub buckets, water buckets, And so when a water problem came up, I just thought I would run to the kitchen and get a bucket. Well, dirt is as good as water, I said, and ran back to my tree. I can smother the fire with dirt. Days passed, working, burning, cutting, gathering food. And each day I cut another notch on an aspen pole that I had stuck in the ground for a calendar.